I think we had a very interesting day at this conference, what I would like to do in this final session is just to quickly wrap up a little bit of what has been discussed during the day, and then I have the great pleasure of having the Portuguese Minister of the Environment and Climate Action, Mr. Duarte Cordeiro, as a speaker, as our closing speaker here. Thank you very much for coming already. And okay, so I took lots of notes during this day, and I won't bother you with all of them. So I tried to just identify maybe 5 observations that I think came out of this meeting, but there's much more than this. The first one is that in the area of climate policy, in the area of sustainability policy, we have lots of successes. And excuse me, we have lots of successes, they exist. We have heard about lots of these successes. The European Green Deal is so far a result of the successful prioritization of environmental issues and climate issues in policymaking as a whole. But we also heard that the successes we see are not enough. They are mostly in the area of climate policy, climate mitigation, climate change mitigation, and energy transition. Those are the areas where we can see really very impressive successes in Europe and in the world over the past years. But there's also a risk if we look at these successes. There's also always a risk that we become too satisfied with what we have reached already, and that we lose sight of the many challenges that are lying ahead. And we have a lot of challenges ahead. We heard about it. We heard about the question of biodiversity, the question of ecosystems, services, the questions of climate policies beyond the energy sector. The energy sector has been an area that has been very successful, an energy transition towards renewable energies, of which Portugal is a very good example. Beyond the energy sector, if we look at the sectors like transport, industry, agriculture, we can see that the successes are not that big. And so far, most of the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions have been done in the energy sector. So the question is how governments will react to this, what they will do. In Germany, for example, we have recently seen that the original idea to have fixed targets for each sector was dissolved. And now there can be trade-offs between the sectors. What's the idea behind this? The idea is to generalize the successes we have in the energy sector in Germany, without any doubt also has a very important energy transition. But also this carries the risk that we don't look enough and we may not take sufficiently serious the challenges that lie ahead in emissions reductions in these other sectors. So basically, what I think, what we've learned here is that successful governance of the European Green Deal means to continue the energy transition, but at the same time, shift the focus to more difficult systems and problem sectors and problem areas. Those are clearly the areas of transport, industry, but then again also looking not only at climate policy, but also at the general sustainability transition in other areas like biodiversity, etc. I'm just going to give one example regarding Portugal. In the latest environmental performance index made by the Yale University, Portugal is doing very well as among the top 20 or top 25 countries in the world regarding energy transition, renewable energies, etc. But Portugal is also at the bottom of the list. It's 174 out of 176 countries regarding ecosystem services. And this is like all the countries. I'm just giving this example, but if you look at it, all the industrialized countries in the Western world that have a successful technological change and energy transition, they're doing very badly with regard to ecosystem services. So I think it's important to move our focus to the challenges that are remaining, and not only to the questions where we can see really impressive successes. And this means that I think we need to focus again on the question of capacity building. And this was mentioned several times during this conference. That was very interesting to hear. And capacity building was an important topic in the 1990s and the 2000s. The OECD made publications about capacity building in industrialized countries, how they can increase the capacity to respond to and to react to environmental challenges and to formulate and implement successfully environmental policies. So this means strengthening the government institutions, the environmental ministries, implementation agencies, but this also, like Max Jungmann said, also means that the government needs to build alliances with other actors that are going in the same direction, with private actors, non-state actors. And this means with industry, private companies, business associations, of course, with environmental NGOs, and also with the universities and research centers like Joanna Balsemão mentioned with regard to Cascais and their climate adaptation strategy. And I think today, in the light of the huge and complex changes to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or even earlier, we need a renewed effort to strengthen the state's capacity for effective climate action. This means for long-term policy making, as Sebastian mentioned in the initial speech. It means that we are able to act preventively and to develop preventive measures, not only react to problems when they are there, but really build our capacity for preventive policy making. Complex solutions. We don't have simple solutions. We don't have simple instruments. We need complex solutions, and we need the government capacity to steer and to successfully develop and implement policy mixes of different policy instruments, and we need capacity for that. But, and this is my third point, capacity is not enough. We need to build capacity, but it's not enough. We also need to be aware of situations, of situative factors, of events that we can use to reinforce our environmental and climate policy making. And Miranda Schroers mentioned the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war changes totally the context of our energy supply, of our energy systems. And this can be a threat for environmental and climate policy making. This can endanger the European Green Deal, but policymakers may also use it as an opportunity, as a window of opportunity for focusing even more on renewable energy, on energy transition and other topics. But also, in order to be able to recognize the situation and have a good response in such a moment, again, we need capacities. We need environmental ministries and agencies that are capable of seeing the opportunity and capable of rapidly developing strategies to deal with these opportunities. A fourth point that I find important, and I think during this conference has become very clear, is the question of implementation. As Nuno Lacasta said in his talk, we have always been talking about implementation. Implementation was a big topic in the 1970s. Implementation was a big topic in the 1990s with regard to the European Union and its capacity to implement and reach compliance with the directives. But after that, it kind of faded out, the interest in implementation, and we took on a very goal and target-based approach. We're talking about targets, we're talking about goals, and the question of how to reach these goals has been a little bit neglected. I'm not saying that nobody thinks about it, that's not true, but it has been a bit neglected in the scholarly world. When you say, oh, I'm going to write something about implementation, everybody's starting to yawn and say, no, not again implementation. So, but I think now we really need that, we need a renewed focus on implementation from a perspective that has to do with the complex challenges to implementation. This includes how policies are weakened or even dismantled in the course of time. If we look at climate framework acts in the European Union member states, we have some countries where we can see that initial climate framework acts were really ambitious and set ambitious targets that anchored them in national law. Then as the targets were not being met and the probability of reaching 2030 intermediate targets were going down, at that time, there was a second generation of climate framework laws that were less ambitious and a little bit more hazy and vague in this respect. So we really have to understand why and how this happens, that the very ambitious policies sometimes get weakened or dismantled. We need to know who the opponents of climate action are. We need to know what their interests are and how they can be turned, how these opponents can be turned into supporters of climate action, and whether they can be turned into supporters. And to do that, we need to understand the target groups of policies. We need to understand how they interact in the implementation process. We understand the powers and the strategies they have to actually slow down implementation of our policies. We also need to know who the allies are, who the proponents of climate policy and environmental policy are, and how we can bind them into the policy making. And we also need to set framework conditions that change the incentive structures for all actors, both for opponents and for proponents of a more ambitious environmental policy. And the European Green Deal, as we have seen during this conference, has this potential of changing the context in which actors take their decision, and it has the potential to change incentive structures, but it's not clear. We need renewed attention to this fact, and really have to try to make sure that the European Green Deal can develop and can realize this potential. Now the last point, and that was something I took from Miranda Schroyer's initial talk. Her message is, we are not alone. Europe is not alone. There's actually a competition between the United States, the EU, and China as to who gets ahead in the race to the successful decarbonization of the whole economy. We have, and I think that scholars and policymakers should really place some renewed focus on this race, how it develops. We should not only think that we are in Europe, we are ahead of the other countries, but we can see that at the sub-state level in the United States, there's a lot going on, and even in countries like China, as Miranda showed, there's a lot more investment in the sustainability transition at the moment than in some of the Western European countries. We also need to look at the dynamics of environment and climate policy diffusion, on the dynamics of technological diffusion, and on the link between ambitious environmental policies, technological innovation, and the economic competitiveness of countries. And in light of this, I think that policymakers should not be too defensive about the need to take more ambitious decisions and more ambitious climate action. We can really openly confront the opponents of the most ambitious climate action, and by pointing out that Europe is already part of a global process, of a global race towards climate leadership, and that it's not true that we're doing all the climate policy, that we are bearing all the costs and the others are free riders who don't do anything. So we can show, and with data we can show that this is not really so. And I think the European Green Deal is an important first step in this race. It brought Europe ahead. But now it's important not to reduce our effort and to maintain the environment and climate leadership that the EU has gained over the past years. So to finalize, I would just like to take the opportunity to say some words of thank you. I would like to thank, obviously, the European Commission and the Jean Monnet Network in Higher Education Program for making this 3-year collaborative effort possible. I would like to thank ISCTE, my university, for hosting this conference. I would also like to thank the great team at my research center at Siege for all the administrative support in organizing this conference. All the colleagues at the GreenDeal-NET partner universities for all this cooperation we had over the past month. And we really look forward to the coming 2 years. A lot of thanks to our keynote speakers, to all the members of our roundtables who found a slot in their really full agendas to bring their expertise into this conference. I think we had some very good and fruitful discussions. Also the team at Free University of Brussels, networking really works. And then my very special thanks go also to my colleague Inês Rocha Trindade, who organized all this. And it's a great honor to welcome the Portuguese Minister of the Environment and Climate Action, Duarte Cordeiro. Minister Duarte Cordeiro has a degree, sorry? No, okay, has a degree in economics from the Higher Institute for Economics and Management from ISEC here in Lisbon, and a postgraduate degree in corporate leadership from ISCTE. So this is also his university here. He was a deputy mayor of Lisbon between 2015 and 2019, and was looking at urban hygiene, public spaces, economics and innovation, smart cities and sports. So a very big portfolio. He was also a member of parliament in the 11th and 12th legislatures, and a Secretary of State in the first 2 governments of Prime Minister Antonio Costa. And it's a great pleasure to have you here. It's a great pleasure to have you talk about Portugal, about climate policy making and climate policy successes and challenges for Portugal. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I would like first to thank for the invitation to be part of this conference and the importance to discuss the climate neutrality and sustainability and the Green Deal. I would like to first of all thank Helge Jörgens for the invitation, and also to ISCTE for this meeting. I will talk basically about neutrality and energy transition, but I will try to answer a little bit about the questions that were set by Helge. It's important, of course, to take, first of all, the notice that we don't have any kind of, how do you say, approach where we are satisfied with the results that we have. We feel that we need more ambition, and we are trying to review some of our policies to achieve that ambition. According to the United Nations Environmental Programme, latest results of 2022, indicates that the world is on track for a temperature increase between 2.4 and 2.6 Celsius by the end of the century, Celsius degree by the end of the century. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been highlighting, exceeding the 1.5 Celsius degrees above pre-industrial levels could have irreversible consequence for the climate system, and we are a country that is very exposed for climate change, and we were in the last years had a lot of evidence on that. We lost 13 kilometers of coast square kilometers of coast, and also in the last year and this year, drought is something that is part of our lives, and we are having months like December with a lot of rain, and also months like April that usually we had rain. We also have a common saying in Portugal that there's a lot of rain in April, but we had an April that was basically the most the hottest April since we have records. So it's a lot of evidence that the climate is changing in our country, and the fight against climate change is only possible with the mobilization of everyone, the companies, sectors, society, and it involves all of us. We believe that companies are already recognizing the need for setting plans for decarbonization. Some recognize the opportunity also. Some others do it by conviction, many by obligation. They feel that they need to survive, and to survive they need to have sustainable strategies, and they understand basically that on regulation or basically on consumer choices, they don't have much alternative than being more responsible and having environmental strategies. Legislative and regulatory intervention in the area has increased to unprecedented levels, creating an environment where basically the companies and the countries need to find ambitious strategies to face that regulation and change. We created in Portugal, as you know, Portugal established a neutrality goal for 2015 in 2016. It's also set a road for carbon neutrality. It's a commitment that we have as a country that translates into neutral balance between greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration by land use and forests. Of course, we know that now technology may create new opportunities besides the carbon sequestration by land use and forest, but basically we look at these objectives for the future. Our road for carbon neutrality established a reduction of green gas emissions between 85% and 90% by 2050 compared to 2005, and the compensation of the remaining emissions using soil and forest, increasing the sink capacity. We have a national law for climate that now tells us that we need to anticipate our goal for 2000, basically, at least for 2045. And we know that we have many risks on our strategy. Basically, one of the risks that we have is the fire forests and the fact that in some years our forest doesn't has the capacity in terms of carbon sequestration that we need. In 2017, the year of the great fires, our forests didn't capture any carbon and by the contrary emitted carbon for the atmosphere. So we know that to have success in our strategy, this decade is the most important one. And we know that basically to reach the neutrality, we need a very ambitious national energy and climate plan. Energy is in the center of everything. I subscribe what Helge said about we need to look at other areas. I don't have as guaranteed the winning of the strategy of energy, and we need still to look at energy as something that we didn't accomplish yet. So we are now reviewing our national energy and climate plan to become more ambitious. We need to revise and update a draft revision and submit it to the Commission by the end of this month. And we need to review it next year. Basically, the review of our national plan should allow the reevaluation of the national targets for 2030, greenhouse gases, renewables, energy efficient, and the pathway to achieve those targets. Also, would revisit and update the policies we have established. The assessment made so far, I can tell something about what we are submitting. The assessment made so far allow us to conclude that the 8 strategic objectives of the national plan remain valid and targets would be surpassed. I would like to give you some examples of the goals that we have of this revision. We, of course, need to set more ambition to accelerate the ecological transition to climate neutrality and strengthen the resilience of the energy system in line with the European Climate Act, the 5th for 55 package and the REPowerEU. We need to give particular attention to the renewable energies, energy efficiency, the energy security, and reduction of greenhouse gases. Just to give you one target, we had a target of reaching 80% of the production of our electricity being done with renewables by 2030. Now we want to anticipate it to 2026, just to give an example of this new ambition that allows us also to set the basis for the strategies of decarbonization of mobility, economy, and the rest that I will speak in a moment. We need to strengthen the planning to ensure a fair and equitable transition, mitigate employment and social impacts, tackle labor and skills shortage, reduce energy poverty, and to ensure access to affordable and essential services for all. Just to give a parenthesis on this one, it's also very important the reviewing of the energy markets on European level, where we will have great opportunities like the opportunity of sharing the energy that we produce. We can start for the future to share, especially in cities or industrial areas where you have more than the energy that you need, and you can share it with vulnerable consumers. That is something that will be an opportunity. We didn't approve yet the reform for the electricity market because there's some issues that were not consensus on the ministers, but we know on this part that I'm talking that will be for sure a part of the reform, the opportunity of the consumers to share the electricity they produce. So this is a very important part to the idea of not leaving no one behind. And we have many transition projects. Some I consider that an example, others are not. So we have at least three different big transition process of when we decide to end the coal, and when we have some companies deciding to end some refineries, and some of these processes are working well as a just transition cases. Others, we should learn how to improve the way we did, or the companies did, the decision they did. So this is very important for the future as we are reviewing our national plan. Other important aspects is this, as I told you, the goals and the targets, including the financing and the concrete pathways to achieve our goals in 2030 and 50 in line with long-term national strategy. To explore the synergies between the energy agenda and the digital agenda to boost the digitalization of energy systems. This is very important because, at least in our case, just to give an example, when we set efficiency policies, the countries that are more digitalized at homes, at family homes, are the ones that can be more effective on energy efficiency policies. The others that don't have it, they are less effective on this policy. So sometimes we don't understand how things get connected, but digitalization is very important also to have good efficiency policies and also good policies for affordability. Enhance the research, innovation, and competitiveness dimension, notably with specific targets and objectives while integrating diversification of production capacity and skills, developing the acceleration of the transition to clean energy. This is also important in our case because Portugal has a big dependency on some technologies. We have high levels of production of renewables on electricity, but we are dependent basically on wind and water production of electricity, and we need to increase a lot on solar, and also we need to increase on other future technologies like wind on offshore as an opportunity to have a more robust and at the same time have security on the grid. So we also need to improve the way that we transform our dams into batteries, natural batteries, so we can decommissionate in the medium term the gas. We already, as you know, we are one of the countries, one of the few countries in Europe that closed the coal plants, and that had a huge impact on our emission results, but we still have security with gas, and we need to, as our law says, we need to project the transition so we can also remove at least the necessity of production of electricity by gas at least to 2040. So we need to create a more diverse, a better mix, a very robust mix, and use all the technology in our hands so we can maintain high ambition on the results and at the same time maintain the security of supply that is needed for all the decarbonization of industry. An important thing to set green gas emissions for the year 2021 without accounting the emissions from land use change in forestry were estimated at about 56 million tons of CO2 equivalent, representing a decrease of 5.1 compared with 1990 and 34.8 and 2.8 respectively compared with 2005 and 2020. That means that Portugal has comparing with other countries, European countries, as managing to reduce the emissions and to be above the targets that were set for our country. Energy sector, which includes transport, represent in 2021 about 66% of national emissions. They had a decrease of 4.1 compared to 2020. And in this sector, we know that energy production and transport are the most important emission sources, representing respectively about 15% and 28% of total national emissions. So as Helge said, and very well, we need to have a good strategy to look at mobility, transport, and to have solutions of decarbonization of mobility, because it represents a huge percentage of our emissions. We are doing a huge investment in transport. We did the calculations from the beginning of 2015 to the end of 2030. Our country mobilized 4.8 billion euros of investment on transport. 2/3 were increase in offered and metro in Lisbon and Porto and other systems, and 1/3 were about affordability. We decided to create a unique ticket on metropolitan areas, unique ticket on municipal communities, and that represented a huge part of the investment of national budget. We had between the moment that we had this policy and today we had COVID. So COVID is not very good for looking for the results of these policies. We can have a short time when we can see that we increased the number of passengers on public transport just after the introduction of these policies. Then we had a huge reduction during COVID. We still maintain the financial support on the companies that provide transports, so we could maintain, independently of the number of passengers, we can maintain all the public transport working. So it was a huge investment during COVID, and after we are now recovering. Basically, the year of 2023 is already the year that we have more passengers that we had before 2019. Just, I think, as in our numbers, only Metro of Lisbon is only the one that still have less passengers. But we are now believing that we will have an increase of public transport passengers. We also had this year specifically what we called we freezed the increase of the prices in the public tickets, so the inflation doesn't affect the pricing of the tickets on public transport. So basically, there's a lot of investment going on public transport. We need also, we are doing a huge investment on the 2 big metropolitan areas, but we are now looking also to what we call the average cities, the cities like Braga, cities like Almada, cities like Coimbra, that we are now also having investment on public transport. That is very important for our strategy. So we can, of course, reduce the emissions. We are also trying to create smart policies for personal private transport. We don't need that. We have more or less 6 million cars. We don't need that to have a change from 6 million fuel cars to 6 million electric cars. We don't need that. We need to go to increase the number of passengers in public transport, and there's a path that we need to follow to achieve that. But we also need to electrify the particular mobility, and we need to do it with a grid that answers the growth of demand on electric cars. So we are also paying a lot of attention on the incentives that we give to the people that change from fuel cars to electric cars, and also to the growth of the grid. So this is all basically, as I told you before, we need to pay attention on mobility. If we don't have a good energy strategy, we cannot find answers for mobility. Second thing that is also important, if we don't have a very ambitious energy policy, it's difficult also to decarbonize the economy. So because we have very high levels of renewables, we are now also to have more ambition, and we will translate that on the energy plan on green gases, particularly on green hydrogen. so we can answer to the economy that cannot be electrified. So we know that as part of our industry, part of our economy that needs other answers besides electricity. They need to decarbonize with green gases, and then we need to have an ambitious strategy on green gases. We already have a lot of contracts signed, so we can have production until the end of next year, and we are increasing the targets and that we have on the national plan for green hydrogen, and we are now attracting also new industry that wants to come to our country because of the renewables. That's also important because of what I told before. It's important that the change also creates jobs. It's also important that knowing that we can also, because we have ambitious strategy, we can create attraction for new industries, and also to give an opportunity to the existing industry to change and to transform. So, as I told you, energy is very important, but not trying to escape to the other aspect. I didn't knew the results of the index that Helge quoted. I will look at that in the detail. We have the evaluation of OCDE, I don't know how to say it in English. So is also an evaluation of the decades, and we know that environmental policy, is performing well with risks in some areas and is not performing that well in other areas. We need to increase the ambition also on the conservation of protected areas, on the investment on protected areas, and also in other areas like circular economy, waste treatment. This is something that we are not as well as we are in other areas. We are also very well on water. We have water quality, high levels of access to sanitation, but we have droughts. So we need to, on water, to combine the maintenance of the high levels and standards that Portugal achieved in the last 30 years with the new strategy of adaptation for the climate change, specifically related with drought. We identified 5 regions of our country that are specifically affected with drought, and the risk of desertification, that are basically some on the south, some on the interior, and we are now also trying to introduce policies dedicated for both things. On one side, to invest, to increase the resources, the water resources on the areas. On the other hand, to try to have regional pacts of development with those regions, with those actors, so we can adapt the economic development of the region to the resources that we have and we know that we will have in the future, and not what we would like to have, but we will not have. So we know that we will have a decrease on precipitation about between 10 and 25% in the future in some areas. We know that we are doing investments that increase the resources that we have on those regions, but we need to do the calculations, and we know that we need to adapt. That's important basically for agriculture that uses a lot of water in some regions that need to adapt to the existing resources of the region. So we know that on biodiversity, we need to fulfill the international targets that we also subscribe. We need to classify 30% in land, 30% in sea of protected areas until 2030. We are a little bit more advanced on land. We are not so advanced on sea. We need to readjust the agenda, the internal agenda, to finance the protected areas, and we are also working on that. Basically, to achieve the neutrality, we need very ambitions on energy, but as you told, and as you said, we need also to look to the rest of the policies and try to have the ability of to have a more harmonized environmental policies. we need to decouple the growth with emissions. We did it on 2020. We had economic growth and we had a reduction of emissions. We need to maintain this path of showing that it's possible. The decoupling is very important for a country like ours that needs to grow, to share the wellness that we create for as many people as possible, to show that the decoupling is possible. Finalizing my intervention, saying that knowing that we have this ambition, that we have specifically in this year some results that give us hope, because we are reaching a percentage of electricity produced by renewable origin is very high. We have more or less 72% of our energy produced since the beginning of the year with renewables. We know that's a lot of things to do. We also know we are now trying to accelerate the environmental licensing. We know that we need to grow in what we call centralized production and decentralized production. We know that is much more acceptable by basically all the people, the decentralized production, because it has less impact on land and landscape, but it's impossible to achieve our targets without having also an increase on centralized production. We are very also, it was very important. Sometimes we forget, usually when we have these discussions and we look at last year, usually we forget that we faced huge impacts on war because of war. And that means huge impacts on price of energy, huge impacts on sources of energy. And there were many countries that needed to adjust to strategies to the impact of the war. Sometimes when we are discussing the environmental results, we forget that sometimes it's something that you usually do. We don't forget it. We know that we had specific measures that we needed to put in place to assure affordability on prices for families, for industries. We needed to do it on electricity. We needed to do it on gas. We know that we needed to end these policies. If everything goes all right in the end of the year, basically, let's hope that there's no need for this kind of intervention. But last year was a very, very difficult year because we need to maintain the idea of accelerating the production of energy at the same time to assure affordable houses for the families. So telling you that for us, it's very important to have this kind of conference and this kind of critical analysis of the work that the countries are doing, that the work that we are doing as politicians, as political responsibles on this moment for the environmental policies of a country. We do it, we are very open to all these kind of contributions. We need to improve, we need to be more ambitious. We look at the new generations, and even being more ambitious, we are not even close to the ambitions of the new generations. So we need everyone to do more. We know that, we are working that. Since I started as a Minister of Environment, I always hear that we don't have time, and we don't have time. So we need to be ambitious, we need to be clever, to see what's not working, how to change it to the less impact possible, how to combine. Sometimes it's very difficult to combine both areas on the same ministry, environmental and energy, for instance, but we needed to do it, and we need to do it fast. We are obviously, we know that it's very important all what we are doing on these years for the impact for this decade and for this generation. And it's very, very important to hear everyone and to have policies that are participated, that are criticized, that are just, because it's the only way that we can improve. So thank you very much for your conference. I'm very open to have all the contributions that Helge sad to have it if you have in structural way. So thank you very much for the invitation once again, and I will be very glad to continue this conversation for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great ending for this conference. It was a great last intervention. So thanks everybody for coming here. Thanks everybody for contributing to these discussions, and we hope we'll go on with this productive work for the next 2 years.